Okay, welcome to the second part of theory and crime. We looked at consensus theory last time, which was functionalism, neo-functionalism, subcultural theory, and then we went on to look at environmental criminology. Here, we are kind of looking at the other side of that coin. So we're looking at conflict, and so theories that concentrate on the negative things that are happening in society, why they are happening, and seeking to understand crime and deviance through that point. So here we have the main ones. So Marxism, critical criminology or neo-Marxism and labelling theory I will discuss with you. Feminism, Sarah will take on when she does social characteristics, but you can pick it up and dump it in here exactly the same. So if you get an essay question that asks you to assess the usefulness of feminist ideas and feminist ideologies, then you can compare those feminist ideas to all of the theories you've learnt about in theory. Okay, so here we're looking at Marxism, and we're looking at how Marxism thinks about sort of crime, and we've got three key ideas. One is that Marxism is crimogenic. They think that capitalism is crimogenic. So you need to have a little look in your textbook at what Gordon is saying, and how rational it is that, I suppose if everything's about money, and everything has a price, then it's no wonder that people are forced to commit crime because everything is about money. And then we need to think about law. We need to think about the law. So again, here you're looking for the people like Chambliss and Snyder, and making sure that that's really clear in your notes. Okay, so Snyder is talking about who the laws. What laws are not made, whereas Chambliss is talking about how law protects money and how law protects the people who have the money and who are in power. And so therefore the law is applied selectively. If you're poor, you get the brunt of the law applied on you. If you're rich, there are ways round that kind of situation. And then you move on to ideology. Okay, so the laws benefit the ruling classes because they're the ones who create the laws in the first place. So really it's like playing a rigged game as far as Peirce is concerned, that the house always wins if you're into gambling. And Peirce is kind of saying that for what we're looking at here in terms of the ideological kind of situation. And again, they kind of agree with functionalism, which is kind of a bit strange when we think about crime appears to be there for the working classes. Okay, it appears to be a situation of the working classes. Yeah, but obviously they want to get into why that is the case, and there's this big conspiracy as far as Marxism is concerned. The rich are really committing all of the crime, but they just make in capitalism they make it appear that the poor are committing that crime. Okay, so we also need to be aware of crimes of the powerful. Okay, and here we're talking about things like white collar crime, we're talking about corporate crime, and we're talking about the invisibility of corporate crime. Okay, so first of all, we need to talk about somebody like Sutherland, and if we're talking about Sutherland, we're saying that white collar crime is not just committed by the working class; it's committed by the middle class. White collar is an old-fashioned term, and a term that is. If you were a sort of working class person that was involved in constructing things and involved in making stuff like a carpenter or a mechanic, and you had to wear an overall to go to work, you'd be called a blue collar worker. Whereas white collar workers would be shirt and tie, going to work in a shirt and tie. So white collar crime is about that kind of situation. So Sutherland is giving us what white collar crime is, and that is a crime committed by a person of respectability and high social status in the course of her or his occupation. Okay, and Tombs goes on a bit further than that and broadens it out a little bit. And Tombs says that it's any illegal act or omission, that means not saying something, that is the result of deliberate decisions, I'm making a deliberate decision, or culpable neglect, I don't want to give you the health and safety stuff that you need, by a legitimate business organisation that is intended to benefit that business. I mean, I don't know whether you've heard these kind of things, but I mean, just something as simple as this. They decided, I think it was Virgin, decided not to put a roll on the meal, main meal and the evening meal on their aeroplanes. Okay, so Virgin Atlantic. And in the course of a year, the amount of fuel that saved equated to over £5 million. So just by not putting one roll on, yeah, then you saved your company £5 million in fuel because of the amount of weight that would have been flying in all of those planes in that year. Okay, so it's very tempting for companies to cut corners in terms of this white collar crime, so that they don't have the same health and safety legislations, they don't look after their staff as well, because they want to save as much money and have as much profit as they possibly can. Okay, so what is this corporate crime? I hear you kind of say, what the scale and the type. So what type of crimes do we have? Well, we have state crimes, where governments kill people or arrest people because of the person who's in charge, rather than because it's fair or right to do it. You've got financial crimes, you've got crimes against the consumer. A couple of years ago, there was lots of horse meat in our steak mince. Yeah, so that would be crimes against the consumer. Some people have an issue with eating horses, some people don't have an issue with eating horses. France definitely doesn't have an issue with eating horses. Crimes in the environment, so spills and damaging the environment, employees being given rights, not being given rights, trust, in terms of government trust, and Carbine talks about those kind of things. You'll find those in your textbook. But we also have this idea of the invisibility of corporate crime. Why is this corporate crime not talked about more? Well, hey, on one case, the rulers don't have the will to deal with those kind of things. Again, Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings. Yeah, they don't want to deal with those kind of issues because it's their mates that are benefiting from being able to step around the laws. I mean, just think of Jimmy Carr and Take That and the tax avoidance scheme that they were doing. Yeah, well, if you're rich, you want to avoid paying tax because it means you've got more and more money. Okay, it's underreported. Oh, yeah, I wonder why it's going to be underreported. Well, people like Rupert Murdoch are the ruling elite, so they don't want to report on the dodgy things that they're doing. But also, it's complex. Tax fraud and fraud in general is incredibly complex and is difficult for your average person to understand it. It doesn't fit in that nice, neat 2-minute newsreel that there is on the sort of rolling conveyor belt of news on Sky News or on the BBC News 24 site or Al Jazeera or any of those kind of things. Fraud just doesn't sit nicely in those, so people don't really want to pay attention to it. Okay, so moving on now to critical criminology or neo-Marxism, and this is by a group of people called Taylor, Walton and Young. They think they have a full social theory of deviance and crime. Okay, so they think their theory beats all other theories. It builds on Marxism and wipes everything else out. They agree with Marxism, and they agree that capitalism is exploitative and is exploiting lots of people. It agrees that the state controls the laws and therefore controls all of the cards in the game. And they also agree that capitalism should be replaced. So all three of those ideas are agreeing with Marxism. However, we get to this lovely word of anti-deterministic or anti-determinism. Okay, so as far as Marx is concerned, yeah, they would argue that Marx is deterministic. Yeah, A plus B equals C. Okay, the state dominates. Capitalism is crimogenic. You're going to commit crime. That would be a deterministic argument. But they would say that they would take a more voluntaristic view, a more anti-deterministic view, that there are lots of different types of crime that happen all over the place, and we need to look at those crimes more individually. And so in some ways we can argue, as we'll look at labelling theory in a minute, and we can argue that this here is a blending of Marxism and labelling theory. Okay, it's a blending of Marxism and labelling theory, because it's saying that the actor has a role to play and society's reaction to that act has a role to play at the same time. Okay, so it's not just about A plus B equals C. So they come up with these 6 stages. Some textbooks will have 7 stages, with the 7th stage being do all of those for every act of deviance or crime that you come across. But we'll go through them one at a time. Okay. So as a critical criminologist, number 1, we need to be aware of the wider origins of the deviant act. And that really is just saying that, going back to capitalism being exploitative, the exploitation that exists within capitalism, and capitalism is crimogenic. So we understand that the system that we live in is capitalistic, and it makes people commit crime. Okay, crime is inevitable, I suppose you'd say. Okay, so we understand how society works. And I suppose here we're building up a little case study of each crime. So our introductory paragraph is the wider origins, and we explain how society works. That's pretty much going to be the same introductory paragraph for every case study we write on every crime we come across. Okay, number 2, we look at the immediate origins of the deviant act. So we need to understand the particular context of the deviant or criminal act. And I think it's really interesting, this Black Lives Matter momentous pressure group that's existing at the moment. And I'm reminded of a black American football player 2 or 3 years ago who was really hacked off at how US policy was going around the world, and how blacks were being treated in America, and the sort of civil rights movement he didn't think had moved on very much. And so during the national anthem of an American football game, happens every time there is an American football game, they play the national anthem, he knelt down, put his hand in the air in terms of a black power fist. It's a Black Panther thing, if you know those kind of things, and was ridiculed, absolutely ridiculed. In the end, he lost his job, and so has been without a job for two or so years. And then we fast forward on, to today, and pretty much in this lockdown period, every sporting fixture, regardless of what's happening, you've got everybody taking a knee and showing support for that Black Lives Matter because of the person that was killed in America whilst he was being arrested by the Illinois police. I think it was the Illinois police. I might be wrong there by saying the Illinois police. But anyway, so now we can understand that the origins of an act are important to understand. Yeah, he was ridiculed initially. Now people are doing it all over the place. Okay. We also, number 3, need to understand the act itself, the meaning that that act has for an actor. Yeah. So in terms of that Black Lives Matter, are there people just doing it because they think they should do it, or are there people doing it to show support? How easy is it for a white person to show support in that kind of situation, and for that support to be genuine? Should white people be doing more than just kneeling and putting their hand in the air if that is what they're doing? Should white people be absolutely looking inside themselves and thinking, well, am I part of this racist kind of situation? Can I do anything to make that racism better, being as they're in that kind of white privileged kind of situation? So the act itself is very interesting. Then again, number 4 would be the immediate origins of the social reaction. Okay, number 4, the immediate origins of the social reaction. The reactions of those around the deviant, such as the police, family, community, to discovering the deviants. So again, I mean, in terms of, for most of us, I would hope, that the openly horrible racist ideas that there are within some police forces around the world would be alien to us. But in some situations, like with that American that was killed recently, yeah, then it's just the nature of the police force. Everybody has that racist attitude. Well, of course, black people are criminals, aren't they? They would have as a sort of discursive note that would they would never say it, but it would be part of who they are. Yeah, a brilliant film to help you understand about racism and the civil rights movement in America. And if you like sport as well, it's a good sports film, is Remember the Titans, and looking at how integration started and how America might not have moved on very, very far from that. Yeah, a lot of places in America would have no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. Yeah, as a label on the front of the shop or restaurant or pub that would say you can't come in here if you're one of these types of people. So we've got to be aware that of the immediate origins of the social reaction, so that we can understand whether a crime is going to go under the carpet and we don't see it as being a crime because we're part of that racist group of people, or whether it's going to come out into the open. Okay, the wider origins, number 5, the wider origins of the social reaction. Okay, now again, going back to the Black Lives Matter thing, did anyone care about that black footballer a couple of years ago doing that? Not really. Do people care today? Yes, they do. So therefore, the wider reaction has changed, and that would depict whether something is going to be criminal or whether it's not. And it's interesting to see who has the power, who benefits from this Black Lives Matter situation at the moment. Does anybody benefit from it? Excuse me. Okay, and number 6, the effects of labelling. Yeah, that black American footballer was labelled a deviant and a troublemaker and lost his job as a result of that. Today, it's a badge of honour. I wonder if he'll get a game again. I wonder if he'll get back into the American football kind of situation. So pretty much this critical criminology is asking you to do all 6 of those things for every single crime that exists. Okay, and I suppose in some ways these critical criminologists are kind of implying that being criminal is kind of sticking it to the man. Yeah, being criminal is an act of rebellion against capitalism. So actually you could argue from a critical criminology point of view that they would encourage people to do criminal acts to bring down the system. Now, we turn our attention to labelling, part of interactionalism. Okay, so you might not think of it as being a critical theory, but it comes from a Marxist kind of root, and it is pointing to the inequalities that exist within society. A lot of the studies are pointing to poor groups who are being victimised by the police, and the police misusing their power in the labelling process. So therefore I would clearly link this to not critical criminology, sorry. I would clearly link this to the conflict perspective. So it's worthwhile just turning our attention back to Becker. We've looked at Becker before when we did education, and he is Mr. Labelling theory, the idea that a significant other gives you a label, and you can either reject that label or you can accept that label. And it's interesting to see how that game goes. Okay, often it's the media that gives out labels. Okay, so we need to be aware of that. But we also need to remind ourselves who makes the rules, yeah, who sets the laws in place, who benefits from people being labelled as troublemakers and miscreants, as it were. So then we need to look at who gets labelled, yeah. So you don't tend to get very many middle class or upper class people getting labelled, but there are lots of working class groups that get labelled in this situation. So we need to be aware that that is the case when we're talking about this whole area of labelling. Okay. So interactionalists want to focus on the idea of meaning. So everything I'm going to talk about in labelling is going to be talking about meaning. And again, for somebody like Becker, and I'm going to read from the textbook here, he's saying social groups create deviance by creating the rules whose infraction or breaking constitutes deviance, and by applying those rules to particular people and labelling themselves as outsiders. Yeah, so in our world, I suppose travellers are labelled as outsiders. Nobody likes travellers when they move into our area and take over village greens or those kind of places. People get very nervous, want them moved on very, very quickly. Yeah, are all travellers naughty and rubbish and ridiculous? Not sure that they are, but there is this labelling process that goes on. And it's interesting as well about, sort of insults, I suppose. You could have a little think when we're thinking about labelling. Yeah. And although you're going to talk about this in feminism when you talk about Heidenson's control theory, women are often controlled with labels or language. How are women controlled by labels or language? Well, let me say this to you. If you think about a word that you could use to describe a woman who sleeps around, and I bet you can think of lots of different words to describe a woman who sleeps around. And then if I flip that and say, can you think of words that men are described as who sleep around? And again, I bet you most men are going to take that word as a badge of honour, a badge of pride, whereas most women want to avoid being called and labelled with those kind of words. So therefore, it's a society encouraging women not to sleep around, but not being too fussed if men sleep around. So you've got this very different situation that's going on. Okay, so Becker dealt with. Let's move on to Ciccarel. And let's face it, from a labelling point of view, all crime is socially constructed. All reality, to be fair, is socially constructed. Yeah, but all crime is socially constructed. And the main word that we need to have in our brain when we're talking about Ciccarel is typifications. Okay, typifications. And a typification is, I suppose the best way to describe it is a stereotype in your head that you have of a particular person. Okay, and so what Ciccarel is talking about here is that within the police force, they have a ideal criminal in their mind, a typification of what a criminal looks like. And sadly, in America and in Britain, that typification includes black as being one of those key indicators of whether you're a criminal or not. So again, in this country, just recently, an Olympic sprinter, 200-metre runner, was pulled over and stopped and searched because she was a black woman in a nice car. Yeah, that was the only thing that I can think of that was going on there. And black women are poor, so therefore they shouldn't have nice cars. If they have nice cars, they've got to be criminal. Let's search the car for drugs. So therefore, justice, as far as Ciccarel is concerned, is not fixed, but it is negotiable. Okay, and when Ciccarel did the study, Ciccarel was interested in this siphoning off of petrol from cars in American villages. Okay, so siphoning off would be you'd put a hose pipe into the petrol tank, make one end lower than the other, you could suck the petrol out and then put it in your own car, so you don't have to pay for the petrol. Okay, and the police officers would often be quite racist about what they would do. So if a bunch of white guys was found doing this, then the police force would go, oh, that's just high spirits, high jinks, they're letting off steam, let's just give them a warning and let them go off. Black group of guys doing the same thing, criminal, need to be arrested. So therefore, as far as Ciccarel is concerned, the colour of your skin negotiates the crime that is going on. Okay. So we also need to be aware of statistics, okay, and the very famous quote that there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics. So when we're thinking about these statistics, we're kind of thinking about how truthful are official police statistics, okay? So here we've got a little sort of section, same one as your book. Couldn't find a picture online, so I drew it myself. It's not the best picture, but there you go. You have here, suspect is stopped by the police, they're arrested, they're charged, they're prosecuted, they're convicted, and then they're sentenced. And people might step off at each level of this little pyramid here, okay? So they might be stopped by the police and not be found guilty of anything. The police don't want to carry that on. They might be arrested and they might get off. They might not be charged. They might not get prosecuted. They might not be convicted. They might not be sentenced. Yeah, but for it to get all the way through into the statistics, it would have to go all the way through to being sentenced. Okay, so that's a long process. So in sociology, we have this idea of a dark figure of crime. Okay, so somebody who nicks my gnome that sits quite proudly in my front garden, yeah, am I phoning the police? Well, the gnome only cost a tenner, even though I'm quite proud of it, so I'm just going to go and buy another gnome. So that's a crime that isn't going to get recorded on official statistics. Okay, there are going to be crimes that people feel embarrassed about. If I was raped, for example, then I might feel so embarrassed about that that I might not want to report that to the police in any way, shape or form. I might be beaten in by my wife on a regular basis with a very large frying pan, and again I might be too embarrassed or scared to go and tell the police. So there are lots of crimes that happen, yeah, that don't get recorded. It's a little bit like that adage that, you know, if a tree falls in a forest but there's no one to hear it, does it make a sound? Yeah, well, the same thing here. If a crime isn't reported, arrest is made, a charge, prosecution, conviction, sentenced, then it's not a crime. So therefore there is this dark figure of crime. Now there have been things that have been done about that dark figure of crime to help us understand that, and the British Crime Survey, which is an attitude survey, or it's now called the Crime Survey of England and Wales, which is an attitude survey, helps us understand that kind of idea and helps us understand those kind of things, because it asks people to relay their experiences rather than official statistics. But again, statistics are socially constructed, yeah, and again we need to look at the meanings behind those statistics to help us understand what's going on. So when we think about the dark figure of crime, and when we think about the Crime Survey of England and Wales, we're just reinforcing that idea that there is a control in being able to control the figures and what is looked at. Yeah. So I remember when Tony Blair was the Prime Minister, they decided that rape wasn't a violent crime. So what you could do then is you could take all of the rape statistics out of violent crimes, and then overnight your government has dealt with violent crime. Yeah, because violent crimes aren't as much as they used to be, because you've taken something, you've chosen how to redefine a crime, and therefore you've chosen how to make yourself look good in that kind of situation. Again, Tony Blair did pretty much the same thing when it came to unemployment. They decided to choose a different way of measuring unemployment, and then again you can say, oh, look, you know, if you're in training whilst being unemployed, hey, you don't need to be on the unemployment statistics. So interesting ideas. Okay, so now we're going to look at the effects of labelling, and the 5 sociologists here are primarily looking at how being labelled affects you. And a kind of the overview here is that maybe we shouldn't be so quick to label people, because that might make the situation worse. That's kind of the overview of this whole bit. So Lemert talks about primary and secondary deviance. Okay, so primary deviance is the naughtiness that you do that you don't get caught in doing. Okay, so I don't want to go on too much about what that might be. I'm a bit nervous to even think about for you guys what that primary deviance might be. Yeah, but it doesn't become part of your personality, the naughtiness that you do. So for me, it would be speeding. Yeah, I try not to speed, but every now and again I will speed. Okay, so you don't think of me as being a horrible person for speeding, you probably don't think of yourself for being a horrible person for speeding. If I hit a child when I was speeding, that might be a completely different situation. And that leads us into secondary deviance. So when my deviance that I do gets caught and there is a social reaction, then that secondary deviance becomes public, and the social reaction might lock in my master status. So you would just see me as a killer because I ran over a child in a car. Okay, and then, hey, maybe that secondary deviance then leads me on to a criminal career or a deviant career. Why does this happen? Because if everybody sees me as a killer, I go to prison, I serve time as a killer, then, you know, maybe I can't get a job anymore. So that encourages me to get into crime even more. Hey, maybe if you see me as a drug dealer, because that's my master status, then that encourages me to deal more drugs. Okay, so le merit, primary deviance, secondary deviance, master status, deviant career. Jock Young did this study in Notting Hill, where he was looking at marijuana users. They were labelled druggies, and again, that encouraged them to experiment with more and more hardcore drugs. And so actually labelling them as druggies and labelling that kind of person in Notting Hill as drug users encouraged them to get even more involved. And maybe that's where we get our idea of marijuana being a gateway drug, the kind of drug that takes you on to other harder core drugs. Yeah, and that's kind of Jock Young's experience of that kind of idea. Okay. Then moving on to sort of a deviance amplification. So looking at somebody like Cohen and the work that you're probably going to do in media on folk devils and moral panics. So we don't need to go on about deviance amplification too much here. Yeah, but labelling theorists have applied this idea that, again, when we're looking at the marijuana users from Jock Young, that that deviance gets amplified and amplified and amplified because of the labels that you put on people. It's kind of like that naughty student that comes in the room, you label them a naughty student, then they go, well, stuff this, I may as well give up in this subject and be naughty because he already thinks I am. It's that kind of deviance amplification that goes on as a result of that. Okay, cool. So moving on to some other sociologists. So it's interesting to look at the work of Triplett. There are other sociologists who've done this as well, but quite often young people get a hard rap in today's society, and they're sort of labelled as being naughty. They hang around in groups together, they don't produce anything for society, they're not paying taxes or anything like that, so therefore young people are evil. Hoodies and those kind of things. Chavs would be another one, that council house and violent kind of idea that came from the 1990s. Yeah, just this labelling. Again, remember, when we're talking about labelling theorists, we're talking about meaning. How do people derive meaning from the world around them? Lots of people will think that young people are pointless, therefore they're going to be labelled as evil. Okay, and finally we get to Braithwaite. Braithwaite's quite interesting as a sociologist. And Braithwaite thinks that there are two types of shaming or sort of negative labelling. Okay, that there's a disintegrative shaming. Okay, where not only the crime but the criminal is labelled as bad, and the offender is excluded from society. So paedophile being locked away. Okay, but there is this idea of reintegrative shaming. Okay, by contrast, labels the act but not the actor, as if to say he has done a bad thing rather than he is a bad person. Okay, the policy of reintegrative shaming avoids stigmatising the offender as being evil, and then maybe gets rid of this deviance amplification, or the you getting led on to more and worse things. Okay. I'm reminded here when I'm thinking about Braithwaite of how Canada is dealing with paedophiles. Okay, so I think we can all agree that paedophilia is wrong and bad. But I think we might be able to agree, maybe you've not thought about it, hopefully not too much, that it might be in a paedophile's nature to be a paedophile. So if you put them in prison for 20 years and then let them go, they're still going to be a paedophile and want to do those kind of things. Okay, so if we do the sort of disintegrative shaming and we just label them as being a paedophile, then nobody's going to want anything to do with them, nobody's going to have any contact with them, and when they come out they are more likely to reoffend. And out of all prison groups in the world, paedophiles are the by far most likely, 80% and over, to reoffend when being released from prison. Now, if we look at reintegrative shaming, okay, so one of the things that I've started to play with in Canada is that when a paedophile comes out of prison, they put them in an area and then they ask for about 20 to 40 volunteers to be that paedophile's friend. Now, they're not being that paedophile's friend before you get too weird and wonderful about this. But what it means to be that paedophile's friend is that you are saying that once every 30 days, you're going to have a coffee with that paedophile, you're going to have a dictaphone or a mobile phone with you, and you get given a set of questions to ask the paedophile over coffee. You don't have to be their friend at all, you just have to ask them the questions, record the responses, and then hand the responses in to the relevant authority who's dealing with that paedophile, whether it's the probation service or the police or whoever. One of the things they found out about paedophiles is that when they're offending, they draw into themselves and have no contact with anybody else. So by doing this, even though it's not going to be nice being with a paedophile, the community at large is taking responsibility for the paedophile being in their community and helping that paedophile not to commit another crime. I suppose on one hand, if you were Donald Trump, you'd probably go, well, the paedophile's been a paedophile, so let's kill them. But there aren't many countries that go with that kind of idea. And there aren't many countries that go with the idea of, well, you've committed one act as being a paedophile, therefore we're going to lock you away forever. So these paedophiles are going to come back into our community. And this prototype thing that they're playing with in Canada has brought the reoffending rate down from 83 and a bit percent down to about 10%. Yeah, now that's really interesting. So labelling the act, not the person, might help with creating a better society and a safer society. So interesting from that reintegrative point of view. Now I need to put a bit of a health warning on this part. Okay, so we've talked about suicide when we did Sociology as a Science and Sociology as Value Freedom, and I'm going to remind you of the things that we've talked about in the summer lessons that we did. But I do want to say, hey, if you can't deal with this topic because something's happened to you or a family member and it's just too close, then on one level you can step away at this point. I would hope that you don't get a question specifically on suicide. In fact, you're not going to get a question that's specifically on suicide, but you might get a labelling question where, to get those A and B grades, talking about the two sociologists that I'm going to talk about, Douglas and Atkinson, are the bits that will get you those A and B grades. Okay, so you can step away at this point if you want, if you can't handle or don't want to handle because of the sort of emotive nature of the content. But again, this is for that A and B kind of situation. So let's remind ourselves of what Emile Durkheim is saying. So Emile Durkheim is doing a bit of comparative methodology. He's looking at suicide statistics, gets them from all over Europe, then he makes this little graph. Okay, he believes he's discovered two social facts, things like gravity that affect you that you have no control over whatsoever, and those two social facts are integration and regulation. So integration affects you and regulation affects you. So it's not you that decide to commit suicide, it's how well regulated you are or how not well regulated you are, how integrated you are or how not integrated you are, that affects whether you're going to commit suicide or not. And then he sort of categorizes them in altruistic, too much regulation, giving your life up for people around you, egoistic suicide, not enough integration, being a bit of a loner and giving up on life in that way, fatalistic suicide, too many rules and regulations. He interestingly uses the example of a husband that marries an overbearing wife, and in Victorian Britain you couldn't get away, you couldn't get a divorce in those kind of situations, so the only way out would be to commit suicide. But the one he's most interested in is anomic suicide, when all of your rules and regulations get taken from under your feet. So you're in a relationship, your wife runs off and leaves you, and you commit suicide as a result of that. Anomic suicide. You've built up loads of money in stocks and shares, and there's a stock market crash. Boom. Yeah. You commit suicide as a result of that because you've got no money left. That you have this, all of your reality changes, and therefore that anomic suicide happens as a result. Again, just for revision purposes and making sure that you have those ideas in your head, there you go. You can have a little look at that in your own time. Pause the video now and go through it and make notes if you haven't made notes on this before. So the two main sociologists that we need to talk about in terms of this would be Douglas and Atkinson. We can add these to a science essay, we can add these to a values essay as evaluative sort of points when we're talking about sociology being a science and sociology being value free. So Douglas is kind of looking at the same thing as Emile Durkheim, but coming up with a very different idea. So he's saying, well, hang on a minute, Mr. Durkheim, your statistics are rubbish. Why are your statistics rubbish? Because they're socially constructed. Can we trust what the family have done in regards to that body? Can we trust what the coroners have done? The only way that we can actually know whether something was a suicide or not isn't to trust anybody. We need to get involved with some qualitative research. We need to get inside people's heads. So we need to do interviews of the family, we need to look at suicide notes so that we can get behind the labels that different social groups give suicide, okay? So Douglas is criticising statistics, okay, and criticising those statistics and saying, rubbish to use statistics, we need to use qualitative research, not quantitative research, to understand the meaning that is going on. And that's pretty much where Douglas is coming from. However, Atkinson is kind of going, well, coroners are the people who give you the reason why somebody's died. They're the ones that do the post-mortem and they produce the death certificate. So therefore they're the ones that are creating the sort of suicide statistics in a sense. And Atkinson is arguing, again, about meaning, can we trust coroners? So in a Catholic country like Spain or Italy or Portugal, if you commit suicide, you can't get buried in a cemetery. It's a sin to commit suicide, and therefore you can't get buried in a cemetery next to your family. So therefore, there might be something in the back of a coroner's mind in those countries that says, hang on a minute, I don't want to give this family a load of grief and a load of hassle, so I'm going to write death by misadventure rather than suicide, and then that person can get buried and they don't have any dishonour to the family name or anything like that. So therefore Atkinson is saying, because of the meaning that coroners put on these kind of things, then suicide statistics again are irrelevant, are pointless. They're not right, they don't work, okay? So we've got two sociologists there that again are looking at the labels that are being used and meaning that is behind those labels, and then both of these sociologists are wanting to get behind those labels. Finally, the final sociologist in this conflict kind of situation is Goffman. And Goffman did a classic study in the 1960s on asylums. And pretty much, I think, the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was an inspiration, was inspired by Goffman's work on institutionalization. And this kind of idea where you go into a psychiatric hospital, and then you get dehumanified. Yeah, you get your old sense killed, taken away. Who you were is taken away, and then you take on this new sort of label of inmate. Yeah, and this is achieved by, you know, if you look at One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, it's kind of the whole point of the film. That you get all of your personal effects taken away and all of these other things taken away, and you just get given one thing. I'm thinking of the Shawshank Redemption when I'm thinking about institutionalization. How you just become part of the institution, and your identity is just part of that institution, rather than it being anything else. And so when you get taken out of that institution, like somebody did in The Shawshank Redemption, then it's very difficult to cope outside in the world, because your identity is so tied up with what that institution is. Okay, so Goffman also shows us that while for some inmates become institutionalized, internalizing their new identity, and they're unable to adjust to the outside world, as we've said, others adopt various forms of resistance or accommodation to their new situation. And again, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is ideal for this. So a really good film to go and watch if you want any more information on institutionalization. But again, what Goffman is talking about here is meaning. The meaning that I derive. How am I going to survive this situation? And therefore different people will react in different ways because of the meaning that they put in place to different things.